This is The Red Line, where we interview three geopolitical experts on one big issue shaping the news both here and overseas. I'm your host, Michael Hilliard. I'm sure this won't be a shock to most of you, but I find reading and watching the results of professional wargaming and military analysis absolutely fascinating, mostly for two reasons. For one, it really helps illuminate where the weak points and bottlenecks in a military's infrastructure actually are. But on top of that, it also tells you a whole lot about how each of these countries' military officers think. And having read the reports on a whole lot of these things, I can tell you there's a really noticeable shift in Western militaries in about 2014. You see, pre-2014, you could almost predict to a T how each side would react to a certain scenario. For example, if Russia attempts to cross the Baltics here, then well, the US would station troops here, and then the Russians would bomb here, and etc, and etc, etc. Both sides had gamed this out a million times, and both sides knew how to react. But then Russia's 2014 invasion of Crimea happened. And rather than everyone being able to just pull out the old playbooks and follow the plans that had been written and gamed out previously by experts, the entire continent was just frozen in place. And for the first time in a very long time, kind of not knowing what to do. None of this was because of any new superweapon or tech, but because the troops that invaded Crimea weren't officially Russian soldiers, but instead were pitched to the world as little green men. That hard line in the sand that had once sat there was now a little bit blurry. Now, rather than this being a military plan that warrants a military response, it became a political question, as it introduced just enough doubt that some actors were able to call for debate rather than any sort of response. And by the time everyone had redone their plans and figured out how to respond to the new situation, Crimea had already been seized, and the reality on the ground began to solidify. 2014 was an absolute can of worms that just decimated decades of war plans and escalation maps, with both sides now unsure of where that red line actually sat. As whilst both sides knew that little green men were effectively just Russian Spetsnaz or VDV units with their insignias removed, the unconventional nature of the attack was enough to throw NATO's response into doubt. And whilst we had seen private military companies operating for decades already, we hadn't seen them operate to directly combat another state in the modern era. As once you begin to introduce PSCs and PMCs, things can begin to get very confusing very quickly. To give you a bit of a real-world example here, let's take a company like the Frontier Services Group. Now, Frontier Services Group was a company that was a spin-off of the American PMC Blackwater, founded by an American, Eric Prince, who's not just any American, but an American whose sister was the Secretary of Education under the Trump administration. But as American as this PMC sounds, it was a PMC that not only regularly hired Russians and Chinese, held most of its meetings in the Seychelles, did its banking with the UAE, and registered itself in Hong Kong, but its largest shareholders were the Chinese state and large Chinese companies like CITIC, all whilst using American weapons to help supply regimes in places like Libya, South Sudan, and a whole bunch of BRI countries in direct competition with the United States. If a force like this was to attack a US formation, who the hell do you send a declaration of war to? And now, whilst we're all sufficiently confused, let's introduce China into the mix. Because Beijing is really beginning to make its inroads in this industry, with China having already registered thousands of PSC companies and operating personnel in over 40 countries across the globe, all of which are being operated in a manner that makes it even more confusing on how we should respond. Which brings us to ask, what impact is this going to have on the overall geopolitical balance in the region? What countries is China choosing to focus on with its new PSC programs? And why is it that even when the Chinese PSCs are so much cheaper than the US, Russian, or UK PSCs, that the market right now still really doesn't trust them? Well, those are just some of the questions we're going to be answering here today. And to take us through how we got here and how the industry looks at the moment, we turn to our first guest.
Part 1. Modern Lawfare. When you look at the international market for security, you have two broad groupings of organizations. You have private military companies and private security companies. Private military companies, these are companies like the company formerly known as Blackwater, companies like the Wagner Group, where the employees are oftentimes carrying weapons, using violence in a way that is much more akin to how we think of standard militaries. Then you have private security companies, and these are companies that are something much closer to what you think of as like security guards.
Carl Peterson is a writer and analyst at the Militant Wire Network and an expert on the Chinese military and PSCs. He's written some absolutely amazing papers on the operations of these companies and their explosive growth over the last few years. So we're thrilled to have him on the program today.
A good example of that would be Blackwater. Blackwater was providing security for U.S. diplomats in Iraq in 2004. They were also hired in the United States by Americans to help with issues around Hurricane Katrina, where some of these Blackwater employees were hired to take an ATV out to someone's house, bring them a generator and make sure they had enough water, things like that. So it could be anything from guarding a bank to oftentimes in like Europe, they're contracted to do like airport security.
Now to begin with, I think it's probably good to lay out some ground rules and definitions, as from here, things are probably going to get more complicated. Now, while the terms PSC and PMC are very often used interchangeably, they actually have some differences between the two. If we take a look at PMCs, or private military companies, these are your classic Wagner, Blackwater mercenary types, the kind of companies that will typically offer military services that are often somewhat similar to what a national armed forces would offer, including things like combat operations, strategic planning, intelligence gathering, military training, logistics support, and even operational support in active conflict zones. Now, if we take Wagner as an example here, rather than looking at it as one big company, we should probably be thinking about it as 4 different companies operating under one umbrella, offering 4 very different services. One that's in charge of guarding VIPs and providing security services, one that provides elite strike forces, one that provides frontline personnel and warm bodies to keep the Russian war effort going, and one that helps you launder money, skirt sanctions, sell diamonds, and carry out all sorts of operations in Africa. And when it comes to PMCs, these guys are usually hired by governments, very large corporations, or international organizations to provide these kinds of services, most of the time operating in areas which are deemed too dangerous for civilians. Now, the legal status around PMCs is something we're going to talk about a little bit later on, so we'll circle back to that one. But now let's talk about PSCs, or private security companies, which, as opposed to PMCs, usually instead focus on providing security services, as well as services that are typically non-military in nature, including things like protecting lower-level civilians, securing non-war zone properties like embassies or business offices, or providing risk management and security consulting. PSCs, as a general rule of thumb, also tend not to operate in military war zones, and instead operate providing military-level protection in civilian areas. And for the most part, that's generally how people tend to separate PMCs and PSCs. But as you probably already figured out, those definitions aren't particularly solid. After all, where does a war zone start and stop? So as you can imagine, the line between these two was already pretty blurry, and while staring at that blurry line, we now introduce China into the mix, simply just further blurring that already pretty blurry line. So Carl, can you give us a bit of an overview on what Chinese PSCs do? What sort of operations are these guys carrying out at the moment?
So for Chinese PSCs, you do have a pretty broad range of activities. Chinese PSCs have been engaged for security projects along the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. A lot of times these guys are doing things like guarding mining sites. So the Chinese way of doing security differs pretty dramatically from, the Russian way, where you think of the Wagner Group going out and effectively being private military for hire. You have Chinese private security companies oftentimes serving in primarily management roles. Sometimes they'll hire locals, sometimes they won't. But what they're doing is they're effectively a lot of times relying on things more like surveillance systems, whether it's CCTV cameras or facial recognition systems. They are also doing things like providing training in China itself, right? So the Frontier Services Group, which is majority owned by CITIC, they are doing things like training Chinese security guards in China for activities in China. So it's sort of a broad range of different activities.
Now, with these groups being private companies, it does open up a whole confusing can of worms, and how tied they are to the state can be completely different from one country to the next. For example, if we take a look at Wagner is incredibly tied to the Russian state, being granted everything from a monopoly within the industry through briefings, tanks and ammunition, as well as impromptu skydiving lessons to some of its previous executives. But on the other hand, if you look at a former American company like Blackwater, that company is very much legally distinct from the American state. And under that model, everyone kind of understands where everyone sits, which is why it gets confusing when China sits pretty much in the middle of those two, as China's legislation around the use of PSCs is pretty ambiguous to say the least. It has lots of restrictions on what these guys can do, but also offers special circumstances where they can ignore those rules without defining what a special circumstance is. All Chinese PSCs have to be licensed by the state, but they are legally distinct from the state. They require one license to operate within China and a completely different license to operate outside of China. And if you ask the Ministry of Public Security if PSCs wish to operate and provide armed security services inside of China, it would effectively require them to give up their private status, since they must be either legally or be wholly owned by a state-owned company, or have state-owned capital accounting for at least 51% of their registered capital, which in non-economic speak means that if they're operating inside China, that in most cases the state is probably going to be the largest shareholder of the company. Now, but before we dig any further down into this, I want to ask you how you classify all this. Are Chinese PSCs just state-owned enterprises, or are they private companies, or where do they sit on the spectrum here?
Some countries have a tradition of state-owned corporations that is much stronger than other countries. So the United States, for example, state-owned corporations are much less common. For China, being a communist country, they have a lot of state-owned enterprises, including security companies. These could be wholly owned entities, or they could be partly owned, right? So maybe the Chinese government owns a percentage stake in the security company. If the PSC is wholly or partly state-owned, you got to keep that in mind, that means it's state-controlled. South Africa regulates its PSCs and PMCs. The UK does for its own PMCs. The US and Russia, they all regulate their own PMCs according to law and regulations. China is exactly the same. So maybe you are just a very boring project and they're really just there to provide security services, or maybe it is a way for backdoor state influence. And I think it depends on a case-by-case basis.
Now, when it comes to Chinese PSCs, there are quite a number of these companies actually in operation, with China currently licensing somewhere around 5,000 different private security companies. But whilst China has around 5,000 of these companies working within China, they only actually grant licenses to around 30 of those companies to actually operate outside of China, with some of these companies predominantly operating on land and others predominantly operating on sea. And if we zoom in on that small group of 30 companies, we do quickly start to see a bit of a trend as well. As in almost every case, Chinese PSCs are either providing protection for Chinese diplomatic services like embassies, or otherwise, they're almost always operating as part of BRI projects. And from the map here, it almost seems like wherever BRI goes, so do these Chinese PSCs. With Chinese PSC companies currently very busy in places like Pakistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Afghanistan, Somalia, Djibouti, Ethiopia, Sudan, Tanzania, Cambodia, and Papua New Guinea, just to name a few. So what I want to ask you is, who is driving who? Are these Chinese PSCs being deployed to make it safe enough for BRI projects, or are these BRI projects going ahead so the managers prioritize hiring Chinese PSCs to protect those?
Yeah, that's a good question. So effectively, the Belt and Road Initiative has two parts: an overland part that goes through Central Asia into Europe, and a maritime route that goes across Southeast Asia and then over to Africa. So when you're looking at these assets, if you're working in a developing country where the security situation isn't necessarily great, you need to protect your investments and your assets. Everyone does this, whether it's China or Russia or European investors or American investors, right? Everyone needs to protect their assets somehow. And there are a number of ways you could do that. You could do it with something like risk insurance. So the World Bank's MIGA group offers risk insurance for, among other things, political risk. But you need to protect your assets from both criminal and political violence. And one way of doing that is hiring security. This happens domestically in pretty much every country as well. But this could look differently in developing countries. So if you are a mining company who's invested millions or even billions of dollars into a mine somewhere in rural Africa, maybe in an unstable location, you need to protect that asset. And so the security company that you hire to do that will use different methods, and some of those methods will maybe be much closer to what we think of as security with things like CCTV cameras, or they could be armed security guards. So when China is looking to hire Chinese companies to protect their assets, this is sort of normal behavior.
So why is it then that BRI projects only tend to hire Chinese operators or Chinese PSC companies to guarantee the protection of those projects? As usually when you look at most Western-run mines, they tend to just hire whoever can do the job for the most affordable price. Whether they be Americans or British or South Africans or Australians, you do tend to see a bit of cross-pollination in some of the Western-run mines. So why is it then that when it comes to Chinese mines, they always tend to keep Chinese oversight?
I think the biggest difference with the Chinese in particular, one, not surprisingly, the Chinese tend to prefer to hire Chinese companies. Oftentimes, this is especially the case with state investments. They're more likely to rely on Chinese state-owned enterprises. Additionally, the Chinese prefer to have Chinese management and oftentimes as many Chinese workers as possible. There is some speculation that the Belt and Road Initiative is just a way to export excess Chinese labor. So a general preference for what the Chinese perceive of as reliable folks to protect that investment, and those reliable folks to protect that investment happen to be Chinese.
So when it comes to US or UK PSCs, they're quite often expected to source their own weaponry or directly work with the government to get a hold of heavier stuff. Now, when it comes to US or UK PMCs or PSCs, they're quite often expected to source their weapons through quite a number of means. Sometimes through US government contracts and procurement, other times directly through local purchases with local contractors, and sometimes even just buying off the open market. When it comes to Russian PMCs, well, those guys are quite often given a lot of weapons by the state, and also given a lot of leeway to be able to acquire whatever they need from the local arms markets, whether it be from legitimate markets or on the black market. But with Chinese PSCs, well, technically according to the law, they aren't even allowed to carry weapons. In fact, according to Article 7, not only are Chinese PSCs not allowed to carry these weapons, but they also have to adhere to the local laws of the country they're based in, and are not allowed to source illegal weapons whilst in the country. So why would they choose to operate in this manner?
The most relevant regulations that kind of restrict Chinese PSCs from operating like maybe the Wagner Group does were updated in 2009. And they do, among other things, restrict Chinese citizens from carrying arms in security services abroad, right? So that means that if you are a Chinese security company protecting a Chinese-owned mine, you can have Chinese management supervising armed security guards, but the Chinese employees themselves are not supposed to carry weapons. So that automatically sort of prohibits the sort of activities that you would see like American companies or Russian companies engaging in. In addition to that, some Chinese companies voluntarily adhere to other restrictions, right? So you will have outside organizations that provide standards for private military companies to adhere to. So this includes the International Code of Conduct Association. This also includes like the Montreux document. You're also looking at the International Standards Organization. So the International Standards Organization provides like management standards for all kinds of companies, including private military companies. So the ISO standards that are relevant for PMCs are ISO 28007 or ISO 18788. These standards basically are like you're looking at something like a document of roughly 100 pages that provides specific ways to implement and monitor appropriate conduct for a PMC.
Which all sounds really nice and helps foster the "I'm not like the other girls" narrative China's trying to put forward here. So why is it then that I have photos here in front of me of Chinese PSCs operating with Chinese weaponry in places like Myanmar, Kyrgyzstan, and Papua New Guinea?
Most Chinese PSCs have not voluntarily adhered to these standards, but some Chinese companies have adhered to those standards. So those companies effectively are Chinese companies that are looking out maybe at doing more business with different international clients. But those are kind of your major legal restrictions on Chinese security services. Like any country, you will have some companies that can do things that others can't because of government preference. You will also have companies that are fronts for the state security services, whether those are military or intelligence services. So I would speculate that in those cases, those armed groups have state backing for those activities. Another answer to your question could be something along the lines of maybe they're just breaking the law. It's possible. Either they're just breaking the law or they have some sort of state backing that lets them engage in those activities without fear of prosecution upon returning home.
And here's where things get really complicated. And to explain, let's go through a bit of a hypothetical. Let's say, for the sake of the argument, I have a mine site somewhere in Africa, and my mine site is being guarded by Chinese PSCs, who, for the most part, are following Chinese law. But the trouble I have is that there's this pesky little village that, for some reason, decided to establish themselves just a few decades ago, right where I want to place my second helipad. And myself, as the mine owner, well, I kind of want them removed. Even willing to offer quite a bit of money to make sure that happens very soon. Now, whilst the Chinese contractors probably won't take me up on my offer, and are legally barred both under local law and Chinese law from doing so, but then what stops this Chinese PSC company simply hiring a local militia or local bad actor, paying them a cut of the money, and having them forcibly remove the locals? What prevents them from going down that road?
Generally, if you have a company that is paying someone under the table to engage in illegal activity, that's going to be illegal. So hypothetically, if you have, let's say, a company called Security Services, Inc., and Security Services, Inc. is supposed to protect a mining site in, hypothetically, the Central African Republic. And so Security Services, Inc. goes to a local militia and gives them some money to go in and remove that village with violence if necessary. And they do that so that they're not going to have their employees doing it. They have someone else doing it, so they have some degree of deniability. That's still a crime. The fact of the matter is...
So all sides here know that what they're doing is illegal. And let's say this crime actually is investigated, because myself as the mine owner was too cheap to pay off the police as well. Who could you actually charge with this crime? Do you try and go after the local gunman who carried out the removal? As frankly is probably a 17-year-old kid who lives in a village somewhere far away from here. Do you try and go after the militia leader who ordered the attack, even though the command structures of these militias are so opaque and spaghetti-like that it's pretty hard to tell who's actually in charge half the time? Do you try and go after the Chinese man who booked the meeting with the head of the militia, even though the two probably know each other and probably met in a public place, and probably didn't record their conversation? Do you try and go after the owner of the shady Dubai bank account that actually paid the militia, knowing that Dubai is probably never going to give up the name of who owns that account? And even if they did, it's probably already then been routed through 3 or 4 additional shell companies to further mask where that money originally came from. Can I go after the company that runs the mine site? Even though that the assets will be in one company, the operations will be in another company, and the company will be legally structured that even if I force them to bankrupt, they'll just move the assets and operations of the mining company just into other parts of this weird structure. Do I go after the mining company's office here in the country, even though they'll probably claim that, well, we're just suits who work in the capital 500 kilometers away from the mine? Do I go after the Dubai branch of the company, who technically runs the branch of the company that technically runs the mine site? Or do I go after the Yunnan branch of the company who runs the Dubai branch of the company who runs the local branch of the company? Can I go after the actual mining company themselves, who are probably not only going to have some pretty good lawyers on this one, but will almost certainly argue that they can't be responsible for any conflicts or inter-ethnic wars that happen in the same country they just happen to be operating in? Or can I try and go after the owner of the mine site and pin it on one person, even though there's a high chance that that person has probably never even been to the country before, and an even higher chance that if I were to serve an arrest warrant, he probably isn't going to be flying in from his European chateau to serve his time in court? Everyone in this situation agrees what's happened is illegal and what's happened is a tragedy, but in reality, who could actually be charged in this situation?
Yeah, so your first problem is going to be finding a court where the court believes it has jurisdiction over this company. You have countries like Spain who claim they have universal jurisdiction, so they think that they can prosecute anyone anywhere for any crime that they want. In practice, this is very rare, but in reality, you'll get cases like, Augusto Pinochet, who was indicted by a Spanish court in 1998. So all of his crimes were committed in Chile, and to the best of my knowledge, didn't have anything to do with Spain. But Spain decided that it could prosecute him when he ended up in Spain for medical treatment. So you have basically three problems here. Does your court have jurisdiction, both subject matter jurisdiction, personal jurisdiction over the people involved? And then two, do you have the ability to catch them? And then three, do you have the ability to actually prove that they did what you're accusing them of? So hypothetically, Chinese PSC, who's partly state-owned, who is using a subsidiary to engage in some sort of illegal activity, you have to, one, find a court that is willing to prosecute that and is able to prosecute that. And then you have to get the people to a place where you can prosecute them. And then you have to prosecute them. And if you look at Sean McFate, he basically says, like, look, if you have armed mercenaries, who's going to go out and arrest them, right? So, that's a question. Are you going to have the U.S. Marine Corps, fly in from a coastal country in Africa to arrest a PMC or PSC of some kind so they can be prosecuted in U.S. federal court? I suppose it's possible, but quite frankly, that seems like something that will not happen.
But that option not only relies on you having hard evidence to charge him when he gets to court, but also that the person would willingly be prosecuted and actually return to the country he's being prosecuted in. And even if you manage to get that person into the country and you do think you have enough evidence to charge him, on top of that, if the company you're dealing with is a state-owned enterprise, things then get geopolitically complicated, as many states don't tend to like when you start trying to prosecute some of their more powerful citizens. And as an example of what I'm talking about here, if we think back to 2002, after the US invasion of Afghanistan, when accusations of US servicemen and contractors carrying out war crimes in the country were starting to come to light. And in response to these accusations, the US and George Bush would then pass the American Service Members Protection Act, giving him the authorization to invade and attack the ICC, and if need be, extract US citizens from detainment and bring them back to the United States, if The Hague or the ICC wanted to proceed with charging US citizens for crimes committed in Afghanistan. So when we go into this prosecution, even if we manage to get the evidence, and even if we manage to get them in the country, when we're dealing with larger countries like China or the United States, we have to know that there's always a chance that, frankly, they may just geopolitically intervene in the situation as well, as both these countries are probably not keen for the media spectacle of some of their citizens being charged with crimes. So how likely is it that these bigger nations are just going to sit by and allow a prosecution like this to go ahead?
It's absolutely not going to happen. No country would turn over these guys without some good reason to do so, which the moral, legal, and emotional standards and beliefs and feelings of a home population is not like a good reason.
So PSCs, even when officially they're not armed, are still able to pull off some pretty bold plays if the state wanted them to do so. Which then leads me to my next question, which is to ask, are there currently any concerns that China could push their PSCs to establish themselves as military contractors in more controversial spots around the world, like the South China Sea or Philippine waters, allowing China to build up a semi-military presence in the area, administer more pressure on Manila, whilst at the same time maintaining some level of plausible deniability? Is there a concern that China might use this option to go down that road?
So if you look at the South China Sea, there are a number of reefs that were turned into artificial islands by the Chinese government. And on these artificial islands, they built a number of facilities, runways and hangars and radar stations. Initially, the Chinese government said that these were for like maritime safety. These have effectively been turned into military bases, which is not particularly surprising. So I think when you look at broadly logistics facilities, anywhere in the world, those can be rapidly militarized, right? It's very easy to move in armed forces, move in security apparatus like air defense systems, ground defense systems to existing logistics bases that are capable of bringing in heavy equipment. So to answer your question, I don't know what the intentions of the Chinese government are, but I do know that very easy to militarize logistics facilities.
So as you can see, at a macro level, this entire issue becomes really fuzzy, whether it be the exact distinction between a PSC or a PMC, or who could legally be charged with crimes committed by any of these organizations. But what about the operators themselves? With these Chinese PSCs being mostly made up of ex-PLA, PLAN, or PAP soldiers, how good are they as field operators? And what do they do differently to the Russians, the British, or the Americans? Are they more like some of these specialized smash and grab operational teams that we've seen operating with Academy or G4S? Or are they more like the poor souls press ganged into service by Wagner to fight the Battle of Bakhmut? How good are the Chinese PSC operators? Well, to answer that, we turn to our second guest.
Part 2. Blurred Lines.
What I've experienced over the last 20 years is the American model, pretty overt, pretty aggressive, different rules of engagement than what we've seen with the Chinese, same with the Russians. And I think the Chinese have actually flirted with, or at least evaluated the models of both. They had the Frontier program in China, kind of emulating the Blackwater model. They were in discussions at one point with the Russians, and then I witnessed Wagner and Prigozhin and actually see it as a threat to the Communist Party. Now, if you look to their apparatus and what they're most keen on, what I assess to protect is Belt and Road Initiative projects, whereas Wagner kind of thrived on chaos, embraced a lot of violence. The Chinese PSCs and PMCs kind of taking on more of a passive role where they are not necessarily armed, but more kind of call in and get help if they need it.
Nick Thompson is a former CIA paramilitary officer and a Tier 1 special boat operator who's conducting countless clandestine missions and combat deployments, primarily through the Middle East and Asia. Nick has directly observed Chinese operators in the field, and when combined with his current work at Anduril Industries, can provide a fantastic insight into how this world works. So we're thrilled to have him on the program today.
A lot of the Western forces and even the Wagner guys, they got patches, they're all kitted up. They kind of embrace a look. They like to be seen a little bit. Where the Chinese groups, they're more reclusive. They have sometimes rules to go out in pairs. That's more of a counterintelligence and security rule. And sometimes you speak English to them and there's a real discomfort. And so those are kind of some of the obvious or most kind of blatant differences that I've experienced.
Now, obviously you've had more contact with these guys than I have over the years, but from the limited experiences I've had with these guys, one of the first big differences I noticed between the Russian and Chinese here is that with the Russians in particular, whether they're operating in Tajikistan or Kyrgyzstan or Moldova, they're usually pretty friendly, pretty open about what they're doing there, and they also have pretty extensive local networks, meaning that they not only have a lot of local information, but they can pretty much acquire anything at any time, and they're pretty happy to trade favors for favors. Whereas with the Chinese, when you see them come into town, they tend to stick to themselves, they don't mingle with local journalists, they don't tend to network with other intel guys or even have many connections with local criminal organizations. And I do understand for operational security that might be one way to go, but the utilization of local networks has been quite a successful model for both the Russians and the Americans. So why would the Chinese choose to go a different route with their approach here?
A couple of reasons why. I think paranoia is one, and I think they're very CI/SEC, counterintelligence security savvy. As you see, the PSCs, the PMCs, they pass kind of a loyalty test because a lot of them are retired police force or PLA or PLN or whatnot. So you see different walks of life. And I think the Chinese PSCs, PMCs, they don't necessarily integrate as well as some of the other forces. They don't establish the rapport as well. There's a language barrier in some places.
This decision to not operate like the Russians and to forbid lower level officers seizing opportunities or taking a lot of initiative on the ground themselves, who is driving that decision? Is it the PSC companies or is that Beijing?
I think it's being driven from Beijing. The Chinese apparatus is not really known for empowering their people to make decisions. And if you look at some of the Belt and Road Initiative, it's going all the way from the easternmost parts of China all the way to Western Europe. And local commanders in the far west don't have a lot of autonomy or empowerment to make decisions.
So this top-down model, how far does it actually go? And I guess what I'm meaning here is what level of intelligence are these Chinese operators being given? As when we look at the US PSCs or PMCs, most of the time they got given just the information they really needed to know. But when it came to the Russian PMCs, particularly Wagner would have representatives sitting in on strategy sessions, their training grounds are right next to the ground forces training grounds, and Wagner's upper levels have got pretty wide access to Russian intelligence. So between those two, where do the Chinese companies sit?
I think it probably starts with a need to know and some heavy compartmentation because of their strict counterintelligence rules. But I think it's changing and morphing. And I assess that the Chinese PMCs will do more on the intelligence gathering front. And that's just going to lead to more exposure, more experience. That's something the Chinese frankly lack, is combat experience. And that's something that Wagner was very strong at. And so I see more of a role for the Chinese PMCs to take on more of a kind of an aggressive, potentially lethal action now mandate. How is that going to be rolled out? Probably very delicately in places that are whatever the Chinese apparatus determines as kind of low risk.
So in your opinion, how good are the Chinese as operators? You just brought up the lack of experience here, as most of the time when you hire Russians or Americans, you can pretty safely assume they probably spent some time in either Iraq or Afghanistan, Syria, or even Chechnya. But with China not having fought these sort of conflicts in the recent past, what is the reputation and expectation of Chinese PSC operators?
I think there's mainly unknowns. You don't quite know what you're getting. You don't know the level of training or expertise. Anybody can show up with some nice kit, but how do they move and communicate and whatnot? So I think it's mainly a lot of unknowns.
One of the other problems within the Chinese PSC circuit I keep coming across when speaking to people is about the high turnover within the Chinese sphere. As reportedly, depending on who you want to believe, over 60% of China's PSC operators don't stay in the role longer than 1 year, doing 6 to 8 months in the field, then immediately exiting the industry, which means that very little of them actually go on to become very experienced operators. And on top of that, the other big difference on paper between these guys probably stems from the restrictions that the Chinese place on their PSC companies, particularly around the acquisition of firearms. However, how realistic these restrictions are on operators really depends on who you ask, as if you ask the Chinese, well, they'll tell you they do not operate with weapons, unless given strict permission from either Beijing or the hosting country. However, if you start asking outside of Beijing, you find that some of these Chinese PSC units are actually fairly well armed. In fact, according to one report that our team managed to get a hold of, this report indicated that a Chinese PSC unit operating within Kyrgyzstan not only had access to rifles and small arms, but also had access to Type 63 APCs, a selection of light armored vehicles, machine guns, heavy sniper rifles, 100mm light artillery systems, and even an old refitted attack helicopter, which is all pretty impressive for an unarmed force. So how realistic do you think the claim is that these Chinese PSCs don't have access to guns?
No, I think it'd be slightly naive to think they don't. There's crisp, clean, oiled weapons on Chinese heavy lift departing from China and then landing. They're opportunistic. They probably buy on the local market, but they have access to weaponry, small arms, heavy weapons, and probably some pretty effective large caliber pieces.
Now, it comes to China's international experiences, to put it mildly, it's been a bit of a mixed bag. As whilst they've had PSCs operating quite happily in countries like Tanzania or Laos for many, many years now, other situations have been a bit of a nightmare for the country diplomatically. One of these less than ideal incidents occurred back in 2010, occurring at a Chinese-run coal mine in Senazongwe, a town in southern Zambia, where a Chinese manager, known to be the head of the private security firm associated with the mine, opened fire on a group of protesting Zambian workers, demanding better pay and conditions for their work at the mine, with the manager's shooting here causing death and injury to at least 11 Zambian workers, and escalating already high tensions between the local community and the Chinese management of the mine, and forcing the Zambian government to deport the Chinese manager involved in the shooting. As the Chinese government warned, it would be difficult to convict the manager. Then China had to deal with a similar occurrence just a few years later over the border in Zimbabwe, where after an altercation between the Chinese PSC manager and some of the local political activists confronting the mine's management, one of the PSC managers reacted to these protests by drawing his firearm and shooting what turned out to be a parliamentarian's son. With both of these incidents being quite close together and quite large stories within the country, it would do significant reputational damage to the Chinese projects in both Zambia and Zimbabwe, with China effectively having been forced to abandon almost all of their projects in Zambia since. And now we're starting to see a similar escalation beginning to occur in the Chinese BRI projects within Pakistan, particularly down south in Balochistan, where a Chinese national will end up fighting with the locals get increasingly angry at the Chinese not only taking the jobs and the water, but also fighting with the locals, therefore putting more pressure on the Chinese PSCs and building up in numbers, forcing China to push more PSCs into the area to counter the growing threat, meaning that more incidents end up occurring between the PSCs and the locals, with both sides just feeding back off one another. So if we look at Pakistan here, a theatre that Beijing would probably find a lot harder to retreat from, how much do you think these sorts of incidents, where Chinese security officers fire upon locals, actually affects China's decision-making processes on whether to expand or contract their PSC programs?
If we look at geopolitical landscape, they've had a lot of negative experience with violent action. I think the threats to them have increased at an alarming rate. Pakistan jumps out, Afghanistan jumps out. There's been numerous incidents. The one that really stands out was the Central African Republic mine murders, where I think 9 of them were killed. So the threats are increasing to them, and then they're probably trying to navigate the Pakistan model. They did want to have armed Chinese in Pakistan. That got pushed down by the Pakistani government. And then at the same time, Beijing is balancing the non-interference policy. So Pakistan's an interesting model because, the Port of Gwadar was supposed to be a flagship program, and it has struggled. Same with the base in Cambodia, but nobody in the international community is really going to challenge it. So you just have a lot of talent, a lot of maritime expertise right there. And so that's probably their priority, where they're going to surge kind of the best people. And then once you get into the Horn of Africa, you're getting a little further away, but obviously some dangerous and volatile places that require some protection and PMC deployment.
Now, while China has scaled down some of its projects in Africa, other PSC operations that they run are still going very strong, particularly in places like Tanzania, Madagascar, Nigeria, and the Seychelles. But surrounding these operations, there have been some accusations that some of these PSC facilities that China runs that have light refueling capacity, as well as some alleged ammunition storage and communications equipment, could be used by China in the future as bridgehead bases, allowing China a base of operations if they want to do something in the country, without the political hassle of actually operating a base within that country. But how credible do you think those accusations are?
I think it's both. Put a lot of people on an airplane in a lot of crisp, clean uniforms very, very quickly. Now, do the radios work? Has everything been tested? Was comms seamless? And so, yes, they're very capable. Yeah, they can surge forces. They have the heavy lift. They have the infrastructure. Now, they're also operating in some very dangerous places. And so I think that's an advantage that the Communist Party sees that the PMCs can fill, because infrastructure in some of these places is dangerous. The PMCs provide a level of deniability domestically, internationally. We know they're cost effective. And I think the maritime domain is where we're seeing them be very aggressive. If you look at what we've kind of termed as the little green men from the Russians in Crimea, we're seeing the Chinese with the little blue men, deputized maritime militia, enforcing a legal 9-dash line, being very aggressive, really a rudimentary tipping and queuing. And now we're almost getting into an intelligence gathering mission. And so I think they are being aggressive. They're expanding, but I still think they have a lot to learn.
Now, even if China doesn't choose to use these as bridgehead bases and is concerned about how some of these incidents in Africa have got out of hand, there is another model that the Chinese can follow here, one that they have done to some success in other countries already. Now, whilst China still maintains control of the facility, and the highest level of decision-making is still done either by Chinese personnel at the facility or in Beijing, in some of the facilities, China has made a massive effort to make sure it is not Chinese personnel that are seen providing security services for that facility. The case that would come to mind would be Hambantota Port in Sri Lanka, where China was so dogged by accusations of them debt-trapping Sri Lanka into providing the lease for the port, that they made it a priority to hire nothing but locals to do the guarding of the facility, even though the company that hired the locals was Chinese. Having locals guard the facility, which means they're less likely to start fights with the locals, but still under the directives of China, do you think that's probably the model going forward for some of these countries that are a bit more dicey for China?
I think for the near term, yes, the Russians, the Westerners will dominate that. That's probably based on pure combat experience and training. But I definitely see the Chinese quietly evaluating. And now what we're seeing are pretty big deployments across the world. So I don't see it right now or near term, but I think definitely they could get to that point.
While the Chinese overall number and theaters are expanding at the moment, they're also expanding alongside the BRI project, with Chinese PSCs pretty rarely ever being hired outside of BRI countries or BRI projects. And on the wider global security market, the Russians, the Brits, the South Africans, the French, and the Americans still pretty much dominate that sphere. But do you see that changing anytime soon? Do you think China will be shooting for that top tier that those guys kind of sit in? Or China will try to adapt and focus on other parts of the security market?
I think they have the ability to, but I do not know if the Chinese are going to really put the foot on the gas. I see the troll farms, the scams, the cyber attacks, using AI for facial recognition, crowd control, taking on more of an intelligence role visiting a consulate or an embassy and then being debriefed under the auspices of, some kind of visa issue. I see that much more than killing people or being side by side for combat operations.
Now, while the Chinese have had some problems in places like Zambia or Pakistan, there is one domain that they're doing particularly well in at the moment. In fact, in the maritime domain, China is quickly becoming one of the more notable operators, tackling piracy off the coast of Somalia and throughout the Gulf of Guinea. But these operations are coming at great expense to China, with the Gulf of Guinea being quite a difficult area to operate within. So what is China hoping to gain from all this? Why put so much effort into maritime PSCs? Well, to answer that, we're talking about final guest.
Part 3. Demonstrated deniability.
Compared to the other actors, especially if we want to compare with American PMC or with the Russian mercenary, Chinese private security firms are quite late in the private security game, protecting Chinese investment and Chinese personnel abroad. They still have a lot to catch up.
Alessandro Arduino is widely recognized as the foremost expert on Chinese private security firms, even penning the reference book on the subject, China's Private Army. On top of that, Alessandro is also a member of the advisor group of the International Code of Conduct Associations for Private Security Companies, an affiliate lecturer at Lao China Institute, King's College London, and a visiting professor at the Geneva Graduate Institute. And before that, he previously served as a China expert for the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs at the Italian Consulate General in Shanghai, as well as co-director of the Security and Crisis Management International Center at the Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences. So, we're thrilled to have him on the program today.
There are more than 10,000 Chinese private security firms registered in China, but among these, just a very small number operated successfully and professionally abroad.
So, Alessandro, I guess a good place to start here is, what made China really ramp up their use of PSCs, particularly here in Africa?
That's a great question. I still think it's related to China that operated very successful with the PLA Navy in extracting more than 30,000 Chinese when the regime of Muammar Gaddafi collapsed in Libya, and similar in Sudan. So at the moment, we have to talk about capacity of the PLA to operate very far from Chinese border. We can see that private security sector is a kind of security gap filler. And I still truly believe that China don't want to have any kind of accident like Blackwater, Nisour massacre, or even having bigger problem like we are seeing now with Wagner, that there are really issues in terms of blatant human right abuse, killing of local villagers, and gender-based violence. So for China, it's still important to keep going on with the narrative of the global south and the win-win narrative, and having the firm that can lead to discharging of weapons on civilian, or even worse, coming back home, being able to conduct military operation. We don't have to forget the impact that the mutiny of the Wagner Group had also on Beijing.
So can you give me a reason why an outside company would hire a Chinese PSC company? You see, even though the Chinese PSCs have the guns and have had some successes, particularly on the water, at the moment, Chinese PSCs still really struggle to be hired anywhere outside a BRI project, even though that reportedly they charged less than half of what an equivalent-sized British or American PSC company would. So why do they struggle so much to be picked up outside of BRI?
Almost a decade ago when I was working on my first book, and this contractor from Singapore, former Singapore commando, and he was operating in Afghanistan. And my question was straightforward: why they choose you and they didn't choose someone from SAS, from SEAL, from other special forces in a time that the West was still open? And he said very straightforward to me, Alex, I speak Chinese. So one part of the answer to your question is still linguistic capabilities. You don't have many Chinese private security contractors that have this kind of capability. We are still talking on a country with only one child, with until a few years ago plenty of work in opportunity if you are a linguist, if you have international capabilities. So you didn't have many family willing to send their kids to do a private security job in Pakistan, in other part of the world with high complex environment. So they tend to do what they usually do when they go abroad. They close themselves inside the gated compound and they minimize all the interaction with the locals. This definitely is going to change when we are going to see a more professional private security sector, definitely not in the short time.
So one theatre the Chinese PSCs have been operating more and more at the moment are the waters off West Africa, particularly in the Gulf of Guinea. Can you take us through what impact the Chinese are having out there?
In terms of sea lane of communication and protection of the maritime sector, Chinese private security operate with the most skill and capability to operate abroad. And these are just one of the few companies that also have operators that carry weapon on board. Now, as you correctly said, shifted from East Africa to West Africa, especially in the area near Gulf of Guinea. But at the end of the day, still these are companies that are looking at making money out of this service. And their biggest problem was the willingness of the sea lane company to pay for this kind of service.
As much as it may have not been a big market back in the day, all of the increased output of oil from Nigeria, as well as the increased mineral output from places like Ghana, has seen the value of shipping going through the Gulf of Guinea steadily rise. But as the value goes up, so does the amount of piracy. And with the amount of piracy going up, so does the price of insurance. And whilst some might suggest that China doing all this work in the Gulf of Guinea is a goodwill gesture, all of the depressed economists in the room are likely to boot up their Excel spreadsheets and give you a slightly different opinion. You see, very roughly, and using just example ballpark figures we managed to get a hold of for this one. So for a Chinese ship traveling through the Gulf of Guinea toward the safer waters near Europe, you'd usually expect the journey to take somewhere around 10 days. Now, if that ship then hires a team of 4 to 6 people for that 10-day period, the cost of doing so is likely going to be somewhere around $5,000 to $10,000 a day. So let's be generous and say $10,000, making the cost of a 10-day journey $100,000, which doesn't sound very expensive, but is still probably cheaper than British Airways. Now, for that $100,000, it's actually a good investment, as insuring the ship for the journey is actually an even more expensive operation. As to insure the ship going through the Gulf of Guinea for this 10-day journey, with the PSCs aboard the ship, we can expect to be paying somewhere between $150,000 and $250,000. But without having PSCs aboard, that insurance is likely to shoot up to around $200,000 to $375,000 for the 10-day journey. So whilst even being generous, we're paying $100,000 for our PSC team, the shipping company ends up saving around $125,000 in premiums. And that's even before we start adding things like higher premium costs for multiple ships being kidnapped, or the loss of time and life that occur if these attacks are successful. So whilst there is still demand in the Gulf of Guinea, and the price of insurance outdoes the price of hiring these PSCs, particularly these cheaper Chinese PMCs, there's still very likely to be a demand for Chinese PSCs in this region going forward. Do you think it is this expansion of insurance prices that is driving the demand for PSCs out here in the west of Africa?
The main issue, as usual in this respect, is money. If the insurance skyrocket, as it happened, there is the willingness to spend more money, more time to save it with very minimum insurance premium. Even if they are Chinese, they insure with the special insurance in Deloitte in London.
So if the demand is there, why aren't Western companies hiring Chinese PMCs and instead choosing to stick with their usual teams from the United States, the UK, South Africa, or even Australia? Is it that they don't trust the Chinese operators to get the job done? Or is it that Beijing won't allow their Chinese companies to be hired by Western firms?
In the past, it was a market open to the West. And now, of course, with the increasing friction between the US and China, this market is closing quite fast to the Western company.
If China is increasingly looking like it's going to embrace this model we've seen at Humben Tota, where a Chinese PSC company hires a whole bunch of locals to do the actual guarding, with the Chinese effectively limited to the management and training of the facility, what is currently in place to stop those locals that China hires and possibly puts guns in their hands from committing crimes themselves?
That's a huge problem among all the spectrum of private security and private military contractor. One of the most important question, and again, unfortunately, still related to money, is to find the proper local partner. It's not only a matter of a Chinese company. Whichever international company choose the wrong partner, they are basically giving money and weapon to the wrong actor that is going to increase problem with local stakeholder, increasing violence, increasing corruption, increasing gender violence, and not being transparent. So one of the main issues that Beijing is looking at as we speak, because they are looking to have a new set of regulation for Chinese private security company expanding abroad, setting the guidelines to find the right partner.
So right now, China would still categorize itself pretty firmly toward the PSC camp, rather than being in the PMC camp. But what do you think would actually push them back in the other direction? Do you see China anytime in the near future looking to get more involved in the PMC side of this?
China tried not long ago to cooperate with Frontier Service Group in cooperation with Citibank. It didn't work as they were expecting. So I still think that China now is at a crossroad, because the Belt and Road, especially in area like Africa, Sahel, Sudan, and so on, need stability. So probably there will be more with local security provider, but going down to the road of Chinese private military company, I don't see it coming any soon, unless we are looking at augmenting capability with AI, facial recognition, population crowd control, and even kinetic operation on the cyberspace. Then it's one of the road that probably is going to take for the entire private security sector. I saw already a lot of Chinese private security firm moving their business model, offering not only boots on the ground, but also security that is related to drone, is related to AI facial recognition, and probably will include more and more security in the cyberspace.
So I guess the big question then is, how is the West likely to react to all this? And in your opinion, how should we be viewing these companies? Should we be looking at them as just private companies looking to just make a profit, the same way an overseas McDonald's franchise is? Or should we be looking at these companies as an extension of the PLA and an extension of Chinese foreign policy?
When I was in Washington during a Congress hearing, someone asked me, are private security in China an extension of the PLA? My answer was very straightforward. In China, with Chinese economy, it's still very difficult to see where the state and public sector start. And also all the CEO of this company are former PLA, PAP or police official. But this former allegiance to the military or to the state is quite common to every private security and private military company all over the world.
So to bring this to a head, should we be looking at these PSC facilities that China has currently operating in the South China Sea, Kyrgyzstan, Tanzania, Somalia, Nigeria, Myanmar, South Africa, Uzbekistan, the Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, and just many, many more? Should we be looking at these as something akin to bridging bases that, whilst probably not capable of doing anything now, could be easily ramped up if the Chinese chose to go down that road in the future? Is that a real concern that people have at the moment, or frankly, is that just paranoia?
In Tajikistan, as well as the one in Djibouti, these are very tiny steps. And again, it's been said that coordination with private security firms that operate abroad definitely is going to benefit People's Republic of China and PLA multi-domain operation. In my personal opinion, in far, we are definitely going to see private security that are locally based abroad and then can provide local intelligence, logistic, other kind of enhancement of the PLA or military operation other than war.
Do you also subscribe to the concern that these PSCs do offer the Chinese a few options that they may not have had before? That by doing things like using PSCs to attack Philippine fishermen rather than using the official Chinese Navy, does allow China to push the boundaries with their maritime neighbors, whilst at the same time still having an escape valve if the US intends to call their bluff? Is that a concern that you have as well at the moment?
Not a matter of influence, it's a matter of capability.
So at this moment, this is an issue that is simultaneously so under the radar that it received absolutely no mention in the 2022 US Department of Defense report on Chinese military power, but is also simultaneously the potential catalyst for wider tensions between China and several of its key partners like Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Kyrgyzstan. And when looking deeper into the Chinese system, on one hand, you might see the glaring and obvious potential weaknesses within the Chinese PSC program, but on the other, you might also see the potential for China to step up these programs, utilizing what could potentially be a whole series of bridgehead bases to create active military footholds in countries in 6 of the 7 continents. Now, I know we've been picking on China a lot here today, but that's because for China, this story is still pretty new, unlike Washington, London, or Moscow, who've been through all this before. But if we look at Washington, if we look at London, and we look at Moscow, and we see how those operators use their PSCs and PMCs to great advantage throughout the globe, whether as deniable strike forces, frontline troops, or some of the most wide-scale money and mineral laundering programs the world has probably ever seen. Some people tend to forget that when Russia saw some of these same successes China's seeing now, it convinced Putin to double down on his Wagner experiment, giving Prigozhin access to troll farms and African mines, as well as Moscow's financial lifeline to the outside world. And that for Russia, when they used these grey zone, hybrid, deniable types of troops in the 2014 invasion of Ukraine, it introduced politics into a decision that probably should have been just military. And now, having seen Russia wield these forces for over a decade now, China is beginning to walk down that same path. Now, whether they choose to create a force that's strong enough to carry out polarizing attacks like a strike on Kinmen or attacking one of our allies in the South China Sea is still yet to be seen. But what is certain is that this will be something that is crucial to watch. Thank you so much for checking out the show this week. This has probably been one of the most complicated episodes to research we've ever had to do, forcing us to do everything from trolling through insurance documents to calling local shipyards and combing through Zambian news clippings. And even then, there's probably another hour's worth of rabbit hole material that we had to just cut for time. So as you can probably imagine, this episode actually took a fair bit of time to put together. But hopefully you enjoyed it, and we'll see how this one goes to decide whether we tackle really odd subjects like this again. But if you want to give us your opinion or send us your suggestion on some other godforsaken rabbit hole, you can do so by following all of our links and info on Twitter, Reddit, Blue Sky, Mastodon, Threads, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, and TikTok on the handle @TheRedLinePod. Or if you're keen to follow me on Twitter, I'm on the handle @MikeHilliottOz. Oz is in Australia. This show can only function with the support of our amazing Patreons, who donate a small amount of money each month to help myself and the team keep this show going. And speaking of our amazing Patreons, this week I'd like to thank Aaron Spray, William Shiflett, Ice JJ Fish, Samuel Cox, Bennett Thompson, Nick, Frank, and Shelley. This show is only possible with the support of listeners like these guys, and we are forever thankful for their support of the show. So if you feel you can spare a couple of dollars and want special access to videos like our full presentation going through the likely outcome of a 2024 renewal of the Russo-Georgian War, a full briefing of who's who in Putin's inner network, or our upcoming live stream going through the nations most likely to join a Chinese-led military security alliance, you can check out all of these by signing up to our Patreon today using the links in the description below. As usual though, here are 3 book recommendations. The first is Money for Mayhem by this week's guest Alessandro Arduino for a fantastic look at PSCs and PMCs as well as the entire private security market. The second is Downfall by friend of the show Mark Galliotti for a full analysis of the rise and fall of the Wagner Group, going from the early Petersburg days right through to Prigozhin's famous plane crash. And the third is The New Rules of War by another friend of the show, Sean McFate, for how PMCs and a whole bunch of other factors are reshaping the face of modern war. I want to give a massive thanks to this week's guests, Carl Peterson, Nick Thompson, and Alessandro Arduino. This is an incredibly niche subject with only a handful of real experts covering it, so it was amazing to get all of these guys on, as these guys are the dream team covering the subject. I'd also like to give an additional thanks to the primary researchers from the team who jumped on for this episode, them being Andrew Gundel, Jemima Pentreath, Lawrence Van Kierbilk, and Genevieve Donald May. As I went through earlier on, this one was a pretty tough one to research. On top of them, I'd also like to thank the rest of my staff, that being Cameron Gale, the producer, Jack Shankman, the production manager, Daniela Juvella, Nate Ostilla, Robbie Sutton, Nick McNally, Jemima Pentreath, Ben Nutter, Genevieve Dolan May, Perry Grace, Gabriel Lane, Lorenz Van Kierbilk, Mason Wise, Andrew Gundel, Isaac Gibbs, Scott Missler Ferguson, and Sean Cotterlem, our research assistants and writers, Jamie Tanner, our media director, Raul Devandarayanan, our OSINT analyst, Francis Leach, our director of breaking news, Mark Spencer, our second voiceover artist, Kashyap Maheshwari and Alexander Vulgarten, our online team, Jonah Gunn, our production assistant, Alexi Heimakainen, our Discord moderator, Joe Hawthorne, our audio cleaner, Marissa Rafter, our videographer, and Nick Much, our field correspondent. There is absolutely no way we'd be able to tackle such big pieces and big topics without having such an amazing team. But with all that said, the Red Line will be back in a fortnight with another international episode. But until then, thank you for listening, and good night.
The views and opinions expressed in this episode are solely those of Michael, our guests, and the Red Line podcast. They do not represent any government or organization and are solely our own. For more information, please visit theredlinepodcast.com.